Chapter 5 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The American by Henry James, Chapter 5. When Newman related to Mrs. Tristram his fruitless visit to Madame de Cintré, she urged him not to be discouraged, but to carry out his plan of seeing Europe during the summer and return to Paris in the autumn and settle down comfortably for the winter. Madame de Cintré will keep, she said. She is not a woman who will marry from one day to another. Newman made no distinct affirmation that he would come back to Paris. He even talked about Rome and the Nile, and abstained from professing any especial interest in Madame de Cintré's continued widowhood. This circumstance was at variance with his habitual frankness, and may perhaps be regarded as characteristic of the incipient stage of that passion which is more particularly known as the mysterious one. The truth is that the expression of a pair of eyes that were at once brilliant and mild had become very familiar to his memory, and he would not easily have resigned himself to the prospect of never looking into them again. He communicated to Mrs. Tristram a number of other facts, of greater or less importance, as you choose, but on this particular point he kept his own counsel. He took a kindly leave of M. Nioche, having assured him that so far as he was concerned, the blue-cloaked Madonna herself might have been present at his interview with Mademoiselle Noémie, and left the old man nursing his breast-pocket in an ecstasy which the acutest misfortune might have been defied to dissipate. Newman then started on his travels with all his usual appearance of slow strolling leisure, and all his essential directness and intensity of aim. No man seemed less in a hurry, and yet no man achieved more in brief periods. He had certain practical instincts which served him excellently in his trade of tourist. He found his way in foreign cities by divination. His memory was excellent when once his attention had been at all cordially given, and he emerged from dialogues in foreign tongues, of which he had, formerly, not understood a word, in full possession of the particular fact he had desired to ascertain. His appetite for facts was capacious, and although many of those which he noted would have seemed woefully dry and colorless to the ordinary sentimental traveler, a careful inspection of the list would have shown that he had a soft spot in his imagination. In the charming city of Brussels, his first stopping place after leaving Paris, he asked a great many questions about the street cars, and took extreme satisfaction in the reappearance of this familiar symbol of American civilization. But he was also greatly struck with the beautiful Gothic tower of the Hôtel de Ville, and wondered whether it would not be possible to get up something like it in San Francisco. He stood for half an hour in the crowded square before this edifice, in imminent danger from carriage wheels, listening to a toothless old cicerone mumble in broken English the touching history of the Counts Egmont and Horn, and he wrote the names of these gentlemen, for reasons best known to himself, on the back of an old letter. At the outset, on his leaving Paris, his curiosity had not been intense. Passive entertainment in the Champs-Élysées and at the theaters seemed about as much as he need expect of himself, and although, as he had said to Tristram, he wanted to see the mysterious, satisfying best, he had not the grand tour in the least on his conscience, and was not given to cross-questioning the amusement of the hour. He believed that Europe was made for him, and not he for Europe. He had said that he wanted to improve his mind, but he would have felt a certain embarrassment, a certain shame even, a false shame possibly, if he had caught himself looking intellectually into the mirror. Neither in this nor in any other respect had Newman a high sense of responsibility. It was his prime conviction that a man's life should be easy, and that he should be able to resolve privilege into a matter of course. The world, to his sense, was a great bazaar, where one might stroll about and purchase handsome things. But he was no more conscious individually of social pressure than he admitted the existence of such a thing as an obligatory purchase. He had not only a dislike, but a sort of moral mistrust, of uncomfortable thoughts, and it was both uncomfortable and slightly contemptible to feel obliged to square oneself with a standard. One's standard was the ideal of one's own good-humored prosperity, the prosperity which enabled one to give as well as to take. To expand without bothering about it, without shiftless timidity on one side or loquacious eagerness on the other, to the full compass of what he would have called a pleasant experience, was Newman's most definite program of life. He had always hated to hurry to catch railroad trains, and yet he had always caught them. And just so an undue solicitude for culture seemed a sort of silly dawdling at the station, a proceeding properly confined to women, foreigners, and other unpractical persons. All this admitted, Newman enjoyed his journey, when once he had fairly entered the current, as profoundly as the most zealous dilettante. One's theories, after all, matter little. It is one's humor that is the great thing. Our friend was intelligent, and he could not help that. He lounged through Belgium and Holland and the Rhineland, through Switzerland and northern Italy, planning about nothing, but seeing everything. The guides in the Vallée de Place found him an excellent subject. He was always approachable, for he was much addicted to standing about in the vestibules and porticos of inns, and he availed himself little of the opportunities for impressive seclusion which are so liberally offered in Europe to gentlemen who travel with long purses. When an excursion, a church, a gallery, a ruin, was proposed to him, the first thing Newman usually did, after surveying his postulant in silence, from head to foot, was to sit down at a little table and order something to drink. The cicerone, during this process, usually retreated to a respectful distance. Otherwise, I am not sure that Newman would not have bidden him sit down and have a glass also, and tell him, as an honest fellow, whether his church or his gallery was really worth a man's trouble. At last he rose and stretched his long legs, beckoned to the man of monuments, looked at his watch, and fixed his eye on his adversary. "What is it?" he asked. "How far?" And whatever the answer was, although he sometimes seemed to hesitate, he never declined. He stepped into an open cab, made his conductor sit beside him to answer questions, bade the driver go fast (he had a particular aversion to slow driving), and rolled, in all probability, through a dusty suburb to the goal of his pilgrimage. If the goal was a disappointment, if the church was meager, or the ruin a heap of rubbish, Newman never protested or berated his cicerone. He looked with an impartial eye upon great monuments and small, made the guide recite his lesson, listened to it religiously, asked if there was nothing else to be seen in the neighborhood, and drove back again at a rattling pace. It is to be feared that his perception of the difference between good architecture and bad was not acute, and that he might sometimes have been seen gazing with culpable serenity at inferior productions. Ugly churches were a part of his pastime in Europe as well as beautiful ones, and his tour was altogether a pastime. But there is sometimes nothing like the imagination of these people who have none, and Newman, now and then, in an unguided stroll in a foreign city, before some lonely, sad-towered church, or some angular image of one who had rendered civic service in an unknown past, had felt a singular inward tremor. It was not an excitement or a perplexity. It was a placid, fathomless sense of diversion. He encountered by chance in Holland a young American with whom for a time he formed a sort of traveler's partnership. They were men of a very different caste, but each in his way was so good a fellow that for a few weeks at least it seemed something of a pleasure to share the chances of the road. Newman's comrade, whose name was Babcock, was a young Unitarian minister, a small, spare, neatly attired man with a strikingly candid physiognomy. He was a native of Dorchester, Massachusetts, and had spiritual charge of a small congregation in another suburb of the New England metropolis. His digestion was weak, and he lived chiefly on graham bread and hominy, a regimen to which he was so much attached that his tour seemed to him destined to be blighted when, on landing on the continent, he found that these delicacies did not flourish under the table d'hôte system. In Paris he had purchased a bag of hominy at an establishment which called itself an American agency, and at which the New York illustrated papers were also to be procured. and he had carried it about with him and shown extreme serenity and fortitude in the somewhat delicate position of having his hominy prepared for him and served at anomalous hours at the hotels he successively visited. Newman had once spent a morning, in the course of business, at Mr. Babcock's birthplace, and for reasons too recondite to unfold, his visit there always assumed in his mind a jocular cast. To carry out his joke, which certainly seems poor so long as it is not explained, he used often to address his companion as Dorchester. Fellow travelers very soon grow intimate, but it is highly improbable that at home these extremely dissimilar characters would have found any very convenient points of contact. They were, indeed, as different as possible. Newman, who never reflected on such matters, accepted the situation with great equanimity, but Babcock used to meditate over it privately, used often indeed to retire in his room early in the evening for the express purpose of considering it conscientiously and impartially. He was not sure that it was a good thing for him to associate with our hero, whose way of taking life was so little his own. Newman was an excellent, generous fellow. Mr. Babcock sometimes said to himself that he was a noble fellow, and certainly it was impossible not to like him. But would it not be desirable to try to exert an influence upon him, to try to quicken his moral life and sharpen his sense of duty? He liked everything, he accepted everything, he found amusement in everything, he was not discriminating, he had not a high tone. The young man from Dorchester accused Newman of a fault which he considered very grave and which he did his best to avoid, what he would have called a want of moral reaction. Poor Mr. Babcock was extremely fond of pictures and churches, and carried Mrs. Jameson's works about in his trunk. He delighted in aesthetic analysis, and received peculiar impressions from everything he saw. But nevertheless, in his secret soul, he detested Europe, and he felt an irritating need to protest against Newman's gross intellectual hospitality. Mr. Babcock's moral malaise, I am afraid, lay deeper than where any definition of mine can reach it. He mistrusted the European temperament, he suffered from the European climate, he hated the European dinner hour. European life seemed to him unscrupulous and impure. And yet he had an exquisite sense of beauty, and his beauty was often inextricably associated with the above displeasing conditions, as he wished above all to be just and dispassionate, and as he was, furthermore, extremely devoted to culture, he could not bring himself to decide that Europe was utterly bad. But he thought it was very bad indeed, and his quarrel with Newman was that this unregulated epicure had a sadly insufficient perception of the bad. Babcock himself really knew as little about the bad in any quarter of the world as a nursing infant. His most vivid realization of evil had been the discovery that one of his college classmates, who was studying architecture in Paris, had a love affair with a young woman who did not expect him to marry her. Babcock had related this incident to Newman, and our hero had applied an epithet of an unflattering sort to the young girl. The next day his companion asked him whether he was very sure he had used exactly the right word to characterize the young architect's mistress. Newman stared and laughed. "There are a great many words to express that idea," he said. "You can take your choice." "Oh, I mean," said Babcock, "was she possibly not to be considered in a different light? Don't you think she really expected him to marry her?" "I'm sure I don't know," said Newman. "Very likely she did. I have no doubt she is a grand woman." And he began to laugh again. "I didn't mean that either," said Babcock. "I was only afraid that I might have seemed yesterday not to remember, not to consider. Well, I think I will write to Percival about it." And he had written to Percival, who answered him in a really impudent fashion. And he had reflected that it was somehow raw and reckless in Newman to assume in that offhand manner that the young woman in Paris might be "grand." The brevity of Newman's judgments very often shocked and discomposed him. He had a way of damning people without farther appeal, or of pronouncing them capital company in the face of uncomfortable symptoms which seemed unworthy of a man whose conscience had been properly cultivated. And yet poor Babcock liked him, and remembered that even if he was sometimes perplexing and painful, this was not a reason for giving him up. Goethe recommended seeing human nature in the most various forms, and Mr. Babcock thought Goethe perfectly splendid. He often tried in odd half-hours of conversation to infuse into Newman a little of his own spiritual starch, but Newman's personal texture was too loose to admit of stiffening. His mind could no more hold principles than a sieve can hold water. He admired principles extremely, and thought Babcock a mighty fine little fellow for having so many. He accepted all that his high-strung companion offered him, and put them away in what he supposed to be a very safe place, but poor Babcock never afterwards recognized his gifts among the articles that Newman had in daily use. They traveled together through Germany and into Switzerland, where for 3 or 4 weeks they trudged over passes and lounged upon blue lakes. At last they crossed the Simplon and made their way to Venice. Mr. Babcock had become gloomy and even a trifle irritable. He seemed moody, absent, preoccupied. He got his plans into a tangle, and talked one moment of doing one thing and the next of doing another. Newman led his usual life, made acquaintances, took his ease in the galleries and churches, spent an unconscionable amount of time in strolling in the Piazza San Marco, bought a great many bad pictures, and for a fortnight enjoyed Venice grossly. One evening, coming back to his inn, he found Babcock waiting for him in the little garden beside it. The young man walked up to him, looking very dismal, thrust out his hand, and said with solemnity that he was afraid that they must part. Newman expressed his surprise and regret, and asked why a parting had become necessary. "Don't be afraid I'm tired of you," he said. "You're not tired of me?" demanded Babcock, fixing him with his clear gray eye. "Why the deuce should I be? You are a very plucky fellow. Besides, I don't grow tired of things." "We don't understand each other," said the young minister. "Don't I understand you?" cried Newman. "Why, I hoped I did. But what if I don't? Where's the harm?" "I don't understand you," said Babcock, and he sat down and rested his head on his hand, and looked up mournfully at his immeasurable friend. "Oh, Lord, I don't mind that," cried Newman with a laugh. "But it's very distressing to me. It keeps me in a state of unrest. It irritates me. I can't settle anything. I don't think it's good for me." "You worry too much, that's what's the matter with you," said Newman. "Of course it must seem so to you. You think I take things too hard, and I think you take things too easily. We can never agree." "But we have agreed very well all along." "No, I haven't agreed," said Babcock, shaking his head. "I am very uncomfortable. I ought to have separated from you a month ago." "Oh, horrors! I'll agree to anything," cried Newman. Mr. Babcock buried his head in both hands. At last, looking up, "I don't think you appreciate my position," he said. "I try to arrive at the truth about everything. And then you go too fast. For me, you are too passionate, too extravagant. I feel as if I ought to go over all this ground we have traversed again, by myself alone. I am afraid I have made a great many mistakes." "Oh, you needn't give so many reasons," said Newman. "You are simply tired of my company. You have a good right to be." "No, no, I am not tired," cried the pestered young divine. "It is very wrong to be tired." "I give it up," laughed Newman. "But of course it will never do to go on making mistakes. Go your way, by all means. I shall miss you, but you have seen I make friends very easily. You will be lonely yourself, but drop me a line when you feel like it, and I will wait for you anywhere." "I think I will go back to Milan. I am afraid I didn't do justice to Luini." "Poor Luini," said Newman. "I mean I am afraid that I overestimated him. I don't think that he is a painter of the first rank." "Luini?" Newman exclaimed. "Why, he's enchanting. He's magnificent. There is something in his genius that is like a beautiful woman. It gives one the same feeling." Mr. Babcock frowned and winced, and it must be added that this was, for Newman, an unusually metaphysical flight, but in passing through Milan he had taken a great fancy to the painter. "There you are again," said Mr. Babcock. "Yes, we had better separate." And on the morrow he retraced his steps and proceeded to tone down his impressions of the great Lombard artist. A few days afterwards Newman received a note from his late companion, which ran as follows: "My dear Mr. Newman, I am afraid my conduct at Venice a week ago seemed to you strange and ungrateful, and I wish to explain my position, which, as I said at the time, I do not think you appreciate. I had long had it on my mind to propose that we should part company, and this step was really not so abrupt as it seemed. In the first place, you know, I am traveling in Europe on funds supplied by my congregation, who kindly offered me a vacation and an opportunity to enrich my mind with the treasures of nature and art in the old world. I feel, therefore, as if I ought to use my time to the very best advantage. I have a high sense of responsibility. You appear to care only for the pleasure of the hour, and you give yourself up to it with a violence which I confess I am not able to emulate. I feel as if I must arrive at some conclusion and fix my belief on certain points. Art and life seem to me intensely serious things, and in our travels in Europe we should especially remember the immense seriousness of art. You seem to hold that if a thing amuses you for the moment, that is all you need ask for it, and your relish for mere amusement is also much higher than mine. You put, however, a kind of reckless confidence into your pleasure, which at times, I confess, has seemed to me, shall I say it, almost cynical. Your way, at any rate, is not my way, and it is unwise that we should attempt any longer to pull together. And yet let me add that I know there is a great deal to be said for your way. I have felt its attraction, in your society, very strongly. But for this I should have left you long ago. But I was so perplexed. I hope I have not done wrong. I feel as if I had a great deal of lost time to make up. I beg you to take all of this as I mean it, which heaven knows is not invidiously. I have a great personal esteem for you, and hope that some day, when I have recovered my balance, we shall meet again. I hope you will continue to enjoy your travels, only do remember that life and art are extremely serious. Believe me, your sincere friend and well-wisher, Benjamin Babcock. P.S. I am greatly perplexed by Luini. This letter produced in Newman's mind a singular mixture of exhilaration and awe. At first, Mr. Babcock's tender conscience seemed to him a capital farce, and his traveling back to Milan only to get into a deeper muddle appeared as the reward of pedantry, exquisitely and ludicrously just. Then Newman reflected that these are mighty mysteries, that possibly he himself was indeed that baleful and barely mentionable thing, a cynic, and that his manner of considering the treasures of art and the privileges of life was probably very base and immoral. Newman had a great contempt for immorality, and that evening, for a good half-hour, as he sat watching the star sheen on the warm Adriatic, he felt rebuked and depressed. He was at a loss how to answer Babcock's letter. His good nature checked his resenting the young minister's lofty admonitions, and his tough, inelastic sense of humor forbade his taking them seriously. He wrote no answer at all, but a day or two afterward he found in a curiosity shop a grotesque little statuette in ivory of the 16th century, which he sent off to Babcock without a commentary. It represented a gaunt, ascetic-looking monk in a tattered gown and cowl, kneeling with clasped hands and pulling a portentously long face. It was a wonderfully delicate piece of carving, and in a moment, through one of the rents of his gown, you espied a fat capon hung around the monk's waist. In Newman's intention, what did the figure symbolize? Did it mean that he was going to try to be as high-toned as the monk looked at first, but that he feared he should succeed no better than the friar, on a closer inspection, proved to have done? It is not supposable that he intended a satire upon Babcock's own asceticism, for this would have been a truly cynical stroke. He made his late companion, at any rate, a very valuable little present. Newman, on leaving Venice, went through the Tyrol to Vienna, and then returned westward through southern Germany. The autumn found him at Baden-Baden, where he spent several weeks. The place was charming, and he was in no hurry to depart. Besides, he was looking about him and deciding what to do for the winter. His summer had been very full, and he sat under the great trees beside the miniature river that trickles past the Baden flower beds. He slowly rummaged it over. He had seen and done a great deal, enjoyed and observed a great deal. He felt older, and yet he felt younger, too. He remembered Mr. Babcock and his desire to form conclusions, and he remembered also that he had profited very little by his friend's exhortation to cultivate the same respectable habit. Could he not scrape together a few conclusions? Baden-Baden was the prettiest place he had seen yet, and orchestral music in the evening, under the stars, was decidedly a great institution. This was one of his conclusions. But he went on to reflect that he had done very wisely to pull up stakes and come abroad. This seeing of the world was a very interesting thing. He had learned a great deal. He couldn't say just what, but he had it there under his hatband. He had done what he wanted. He had seen the great things, and he had given his mind a chance to improve, if it would. He cheerfully believed that it had improved. Yes, this seeing of the world was very pleasant, and he would willingly do a little more of it. 36 years old as he was, he had a handsome stretch of life before him yet, and he need not begin to count his weeks. Where should he take the world next? I have said that he remembered the eyes of the lady whom he had found standing in Mrs. Tristram's drawing-room. 4 months had elapsed, and he had not forgotten them yet. He had looked, he had made a point of looking, into a great many other eyes in the interval, but the only ones he thought of now were Madame de Cintré's. If he wanted to see more of the world, should he find it in Madame de Cintré's eyes? He would certainly find something there, call it this world or the next. Throughout these rather formless meditations he sometimes thought of his past life and the long array of years, they had begun so early, during which he had had nothing in his head but enterprise. They seemed far away now, for his present attitude was more than a holiday, it was almost a rupture. He had told Tristram that the pendulum was swinging back, and it appeared that the backward swing had not yet ended. Still, enterprise, which was over in the other quarter, wore to his mind a different aspect at different hours. In its train 1,000 forgotten episodes came trooping back into his memory. Some of them he looked at complacently enough in the face. From some he averted his head. They were old efforts, old exploits, antiquated examples of smartness and sharpness. Some of them, as he looked at them, he felt decidedly proud of. He admired himself as if he had been looking at another man. And, in fact, many of the qualities that make a great deed were there. The decision, the resolution, the courage, the celerity, the clear eye, and the strong hand. Of certain other achievements it would be going too far to say that he was ashamed of them, for Newman had never had a stomach for dirty work. He was blessed with a natural impulse to disfigure with a direct, unreasoning blow the comely visage of temptation. And certainly in no man could a want of integrity have been less excusable. Newman knew the crooked from the straight at a glance, and the former had cost him, first and last, a great many moments of lively disgust. But none the less some of his memories seemed to wear at present a rather graceless and sordid mien, and it struck him that if he had never done anything very ugly, he had never, on the other hand, done anything particularly beautiful. He had spent his years in the unremitting effort to add thousands to thousands, and now that he stood well outside of it, the business of money-getting appeared tolerably dry and sterile. It is very well to sneer at money-getting after you have filled your pockets, and Newman, it may be said, should have begun somewhat earlier to moralize thus delicately. To this it may be answered that he might have made another fortune if he chose, and we ought to add that he was not exactly moralizing. It had come back to him simply that what he had been looking at all summer was a very rich and beautiful world, and that it had not all been made by sharp railroad men and stockbrokers. During his stay at Baden-Baden he received a letter from Mrs. Tristram, scolding him for the scanty tidings he had sent to his friends of the Avenue d'Iéna, and begging to be definitely informed that he had not concocted any horrid scheme for wintering in outlying regions, but was coming back sanely and promptly to the most comfortable city in the world. Newman's answer ran as follows: I supposed you knew I was a miserable letter writer, and didn't expect anything of me. I don't think I have written 20 letters of pure friendship in my whole life. In America I conducted my correspondence altogether by telegrams. This is a letter of pure friendship. You have got hold of a curiosity, and I hope you will value it. You want to know everything that has happened to me in these 3 months. The best way to tell you, I think, would be to send you my half-dozen guide-books, with my pencil marks in the margin. Wherever you find a scratch or a cross or a "beautiful" or a "so true" or a "too thin," you may know that I have had a sensation of some sort or the other. That has been about my history ever since I left you. Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Germany, Italy. I have been through the whole list, and I don't think I am any the worse for it. I know more about Madonnas and church steeples than I supposed any man could. I have seen some very pretty things, and shall perhaps talk them over this winter by your fireside. You see, my face is not altogether set against Paris. I have had all kinds of plans and visions, but your letter has blown most of them away. L'appétit vient en mangeant, says the French proverb, and I find that the more I see of the world, the more I want to see. Now that I am in the shafts, why shouldn't I trot to the end of the course? Sometimes I think of the Far East, and keep rolling the names of Eastern cities under my tongue, Damascus and Baghdad, Medina and Mecca. I spent a week last month in the company of a returned missionary, who told me I ought to be ashamed to be loafing about Europe when there are such big things to be seen out there. I do want to explore, but I think I would rather explore over in the Rue de l'Université. Do you ever hear from that pretty lady? If you can get her to promise she will be at home the next time I call, I will go back to Paris straight. I am more than ever in the state of mind I told you about that evening. I want a first-class wife. I have kept an eye on all the pretty girls I have come across this summer, but none of them came up to my notion, or anywhere near it. I should have enjoyed all this 1,000 times more if I had had the lady just mentioned by my side. The nearest approach to her was a Unitarian minister from Boston, who very soon demanded a separation for incompatibility of temper. He told me I was low-minded, immoral, a devotee of art for art, whatever that is, all of which greatly afflicted me, for he was really a sweet little fellow. But shortly afterwards I met an Englishman, with whom I struck up an acquaintance which at first seemed to promise well, a very bright man who writes in the London papers, and knows Paris nearly as well as Tristram. We knocked about for a week together, but he very soon gave me up in disgust. I was too virtuous by half. I was too stern a moralist. He told me, in a friendly way, that I was cursed with a conscience, that I judged things like a Methodist, and talked about them like an old lady. This was rather bewildering. Which of my two critics was I to believe? I didn't worry about it, and very soon made up my mind that they were both idiots. But there is one thing in which no one will ever have the impudence to pretend I am wrong. That is, in being your faithful friend, C.N. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The American by Henry James. Chapter 6. Newman gave up Damascus and Baghdad and returned to Paris before the autumn was over. He established himself in some rooms selected for him by Tom Tristram, in accordance with the latter's estimate of what he called his social position. When Newman learned that his social position was to be taken into account, he professed himself utterly incompetent, and begged Tristram to relieve him of the care. "I didn't know I had a social position," he said, "and if I have, I haven't the smallest idea what it is. Isn't a social position knowing some 2,000 or 3,000 people and inviting them to dinner? I know you and your wife and little old Mr. Nioche, who gave me French lessons last spring. Can I invite you to dinner to meet each other? If I can, you must come tomorrow." "That is not very grateful to me," said Mrs. Tristram, "who introduced you last year to every creature I know." "So you did. I had quite forgotten. But I thought you wanted me to forget," said Newman, with that tone of simple deliberateness which frequently marked his utterance, and which an observer would not have known whether to pronounce a somewhat mysteriously humorous affection of ignorance or a modest aspiration to knowledge. "You told me you disliked them all." "Ah, the way you remember what I say is at least very flattering. But in future," added Mrs. Tristram, "pray forget all the wicked things and remember only the good ones. It will be easily done, and it will not fatigue your memory. But I forewarn you that if you trust my husband to pick out your rooms, you are in for something hideous." "Hideous, darling?" cried Tristram. "To-day I must say nothing wicked, otherwise I should use stronger language." "What do you think she would say, Newman?" asked Tristram. "If she really tried now? She can express displeasure volubly in 2 or 3 languages. That's what it is to be intellectual." "It gives me the start of her completely, for I can't swear for the life of me, except in English. When I get mad, I have to fall back on our dear old mother tongue. There's nothing like it, after all." Newman declared that he knew nothing about tables and chairs, and that he would accept in the way of a lodging, with his eyes shut, anything that Tristram should offer him. This was partly veracity on our hero's part, but it was also partly charity. He knew that to pry about and look at rooms, and make people open windows, and poke into sofas with his cane, and gossip with landladies, and ask who lived above and who below, he knew that this was of all pastimes the dearest to Tristram's heart, and he felt the more disposed to put it in his way as he was conscious that, as regards his obliging friend, he had suffered the warmth of ancient good fellowship somewhat to abate. Besides, he had no taste for upholstery. He had even no very exquisite sense of comfort or convenience. He had a relish for luxury and splendor, but it was satisfied by rather gross contrivances. He scarcely knew a hard chair from a soft one, and he possessed a talent for stretching his legs which quite dispensed with adventitious facilities. His idea of comfort was to inhabit very large rooms, have a great many of them, and be conscious of their possessing a number of patented mechanical devices, half of which he should never have occasion to use. The apartments should be light and brilliant and lofty. He had once said that he liked rooms in which you wanted to keep your hat on. For the rest, he was satisfied with the assurance of any respectable person that everything was handsome. Tristram accordingly secured for him an apartment to which this epithet might be lavishly applied. It was situated on the Boulevard Haussmann, on the first floor, and consisted of a series of rooms, gilded from floor to ceiling a foot thick, draped in various light shades of satin, and chiefly furnished with mirrors and clocks. Newman thought them magnificent, thanked Tristram heartily, immediately took possession, and had one of his trunks standing for 3 months in his drawing-room. One day Mrs. Tristram told him that her beautiful friend, Madame de Cintré, had returned from the country, that she had met her 3 days before, coming out of the church of Saint-Sulpice, she herself having journeyed to that distant quarter in quest of an obscure lace-mender of whom skill she had heard high praise. "And how were those eyes?" Newman asked. "Those eyes were red with weeping, if you please," said Mrs. Tristram. "She had been to confession." "It doesn't tally with your account of her," said Newman, "that she should have sins to confess." They were not sins, they were sufferings. How do you know that? She asked me to come and see her. I went this morning. And what does she suffer from? I didn't ask her. With her, somehow, one is very discreet. But I guessed easily enough. She suffers from her wicked old mother and her Grand Turk of a brother. They persecute her. But I can almost forgive them, because, as I told you, she is a saint, and a persecution is all that she needs to bring out her saintliness and make her perfect. That's a comfortable theory for her. I hope you will never impart it to the old folks. Why does she let them bully her? Is she not her own mistress? Legally, yes, I suppose, but morally, no. In France you must never say nay to your mother, whatever she requires of you. She may be the most abominable old woman in the world and make your life a purgatory, but after all she is ma mère, and you have no right to judge her. You have simply to obey. The thing has a fine side to it. Madame de Cintré bows her head and folds her wings. Can't she at least make her brother leave off? Her brother is the chef de la famille, as they say. He is the head of the clan. With those people the family is everything. You must act, not for your own pleasure, but for the advantage of the family. I wonder what my family would like me to do, exclaimed Tristram. I wish you had one, said his wife. But what do they want to get out of that poor lady? Newman asked. Another marriage. They are not rich, and they want to bring more money into the family. There's your chance, my boy, said Tristram. And Madame de Cintré objects, Newman continued. She has been sold once. She naturally objects to being sold again. It appears that the first time they made a rather poor bargain. Monsieur de Cintré left a scanty property. And to whom do they want to marry her now? I thought it best not to ask, but you may be sure it is to some horrid old nabob, or to some dissipated little duke. There's Mrs. Tristram as large as life, cried her husband. Observe the richness of her imagination. She has not a single question. It's vulgar to ask questions, and yet she knows everything. She has the history of Madame de Cintré's marriage at her fingers' ends. She has seen the lovely Claire on her knees, with loosened tresses and streaming eyes, and the rest of them standing over her with spikes and goads and red-hot irons, ready to come down on her if she refuses the tipsy duke. The simple truth is that they made a fuss about her milliner's bill, or refused her an opera box. Newman looked from Tristram to his wife with a certain mistrust in each direction. Do you really mean, he asked of Mrs. Tristram, that your friend is being forced into an unhappy marriage? I think it extremely probable. Those people are very capable of that sort of thing. It is like something in a play, said Newman. That dark old house over there looks as if wicked things had been done in it, and might be done again. They have a still darker old house in the country, Madame de Cintré tells me, and there, during the summer, this scheme must have been hatched. Must have been, mind that, said Tristram. After all, suggested Newman after a silence, she may be in trouble about something else. If it is something else, then it is something worse, said Mrs. Tristram with rich decision. Newman was silent a while, and seemed lost in meditation. Is it possible, he asked at last, that they do that sort of thing over there? That helpless women are bullied into marrying men they hate? Helpless women all over the world have a hard time of it, said Mrs. Tristram. There is plenty of bullying everywhere. A great deal of that kind of thing goes on in New York, said Tristram. Girls are bullied or coaxed or bribed, or all three together, into marrying nasty fellows. There is no end of that always going on in the Fifth Avenue, and other bad things besides. The mysteries of the Fifth Avenue. Someone ought to show them up. I don't believe it, said Newman very gravely. I don't believe that in America girls are ever subjected to compulsion. I don't believe there have been a dozen cases of it since the country began. Listen to the voice of the spread eagle, cried Tristram. The spread eagle ought to use his wings, said Mrs. Tristram. Fly to the rescue of Madame de Cintré. To her rescue? Pounce down, seize her in your talons, and carry her off. Marry her yourself." Newman, for some moments, answered nothing, but presently, "I should suppose she had heard enough of marrying," he said. "The kindest way to treat her would be to admire her, and yet never to speak of it. But that sort of thing is infamous," he added. "It makes me feel savage to hear of it." He heard of it, however, more than once afterward. Mrs. Tristram again saw Madame de Cintré, and again found her looking very sad. But on these occasions there had been no tears. Her beautiful eyes were clear and still. "She is cold, calm, and hopeless," Mrs. Tristram declared; and she added that on her mentioning that her friend Mr. Newman was again in Paris, and was faithful in his desire to make Madame de Cintré's acquaintance, this lovely woman had found a smile in her despair, and declared that she was sorry to have missed his visit in the spring, and that she hoped he had not lost courage. "I told her something about you," said Mrs. Tristram. "That's a comfort," said Newman placidly. "I like people to know about me." A few days after this, one dusky autumn afternoon, he went again to the Rue de l'Université. The early evening had closed in as he applied for admittance at the stoutly guarded Hôtel de Bellegarde. He was told that Madame de Cintré was at home. He crossed the court, entered the farther door, and was conducted through a vestibule, vast, dim, and cold, up a broad stone staircase with an ancient iron balustrade, to an apartment on the second floor. Announced and ushered in, he found himself in a sort of a paneled boudoir, at one end of which a lady and a gentleman were seated before the fire. The gentleman was smoking a cigarette. There was no light in the room save that of a couple of candles and the glow from the hearth. Both persons rose to welcome Newman, who, in the firelight, recognized Madame de Cintré. She gave him her hand with a smile which seemed in itself an illumination, and pointing to her companion, said softly, "My brother." The gentleman offered Newman a frank, friendly greeting, and our hero then perceived him to be the young man who had spoken to him in the court of the hotel on his former visit, and who had struck him as a good fellow. "Mrs. Tristram has spoken to me a great deal of you," said Madame de Cintré gently, as she resumed her former place. Newman, after he had seated himself, began to consider what, in truth, was his errand. He had an unusual, unexpected sense of having wandered into a strange corner of the world. He was not given, as a general thing, to anticipating danger or forecasting disaster, and he had had no social tremors on this particular occasion. He was not timid, and he was not impudent. He felt too kindly towards himself to be the one, and too good-naturedly toward the rest of the world to be the other. But his native shrewdness sometimes placed his ease of temper at its mercy. With every disposition to take things simply, it was obliged to perceive that some things were not so simple as others. He felt as one does in missing a step in an ascent where one expected to find it. This strange, pretty woman, sitting in fireside talk with her brother, in the gray depths of her inhospitable-looking house, what had he to say to her? She seemed enveloped in a sort of fantastic privacy. On what grounds had he pulled away the curtain? For a moment he felt as if he had been plunged into some medium as deep as the ocean, and as if he must exert himself to keep from sinking. Meanwhile he was looking at Madame de Cintré, and she was settling herself in her chair and drawing in her long dress and turning her face towards him. Their eyes met. A moment afterwards she looked away and motioned to her brother to put a log on the fire. But the moment, and the glance which traversed it, had been sufficient to relieve Newman of the first and the last fit of personal embarrassment he was ever to know. He performed the movement which was so frequent with him, and which was always a sort of a symbol of his taking mental possession of a scene. He extended his legs. The impression Madame de Cintré had made upon him on their first meeting came back in an instant. It had been deeper than he knew. She was pleasing, she was interesting. He had opened a book, and the first lines held his attention. She asked him several questions. How lately he had seen Mrs. Tristram, how long he had been in Paris, how long he expected to remain there, how he liked it. She spoke English without an accent, or rather with that distinctively British accent which on his arrival in Europe had struck Newman as an altogether foreign tongue, but which in women he had come to like extremely. Here and there Madame de Cintré's utterance had a faint shade of strangeness, but at the end of 10 minutes Newman found himself waiting for these soft roughnesses. He enjoyed them, and he marveled to see that gross thing, error, brought down to so fine a point. "You have a beautiful country," said Madame de Cintré presently. "Oh, magnificent!" said Newman. "You ought to see it." "I shall never see it," said Madame de Cintré with a smile. "Why not?" asked Newman. "I don't travel, especially so far." "But you go away sometimes. You are not always here." "I go away in summer, a little way, to the country." Newman wanted to ask her something more, something personal, he hardly knew what. "Don't you find it rather quiet here?" he said, "so far from the street?" "Rather gloomy," he was going to say, but he reflected that that would be impolite. "Yes, it is very quiet," said Madame de Cintré, "but we like that." "Ah, you like it," repeated Newman slowly. "Besides, I have lived here all my life." "Lived here all your life," said Newman in the same way. "I was born here, and my father was born here before me, and my grandfather, and my great-grandfathers. Were they not, Valentin?" And she appealed to her brother. "Yes, it's a family habit to be born here," the young man said with a laugh, and rose and threw the remnant of his cigarette into the fire, and then remained leaning against the chimney-piece. An observer would have perceived that he wished to take a better look at Newman, whom he covertly examined, while he stood stroking his moustache. "Your house is tremendously old, then," said Newman. "How old is it, brother?" asked Madame de Cintré. The young man took the 2 candles from the mantel-shelf, lifted one high in each hand, and looked up towards the cornice of the room, above the chimney-piece. This latter feature of the apartment was of white marble, in the familiar rococo style of the last century; but above it was a paneling of an earlier date, quaintly carved, painted white, and gilded here and there. The white had turned to yellow, and the gilding was tarnished. On the top, the figures ranged themselves into a sort of shield, on which an armorial device was cut. Above it, in relief, was a date, 1627. "There you have it," said the young man. "That is old or new, according to your point of view." "Well, over here," said Newman, "one's point of view gets shifted around considerably." And he threw back his head and looked about the room. "Your house is of a very curious style of architecture," he said. "Are you interested in architecture?" asked the young man at the chimney-piece. "Well, I took the trouble this summer," said Newman, "to examine, as well as I can calculate, some 470 churches. Do you call that interested?" "Perhaps you are interested in theology," said the young man. "Not particularly. Are you a Roman Catholic, madam?" And he turned to Madame de Cintré. "Yes, sir," she answered gravely. Newman was struck with the gravity of her tone. He threw back his head and began to look around the room again. "Had you never noticed that number up there?" he presently asked. She hesitated a moment, and then, "In former years," she said. Her brother had been watching Newman's movement. "Perhaps you would like to examine the house," he said. Newman slowly brought down his eyes and looked at him. He had a vague impression that the young man at the chimney-piece was inclined to irony. He was a handsome fellow, his face wore a smile, his moustaches were curled up at the ends, and there was a little dancing gleam in his eye. "Damn his French impudence," Newman was on the point of saying to himself. "What the deuce is he grinning at?" He glanced at Madame de Cintré. She was sitting with her eyes fixed on the floor. She raised them, they met his, and she looked at her brother. Newman turned again to this young man and observed that he strikingly resembled his sister. This was in his favor, and our hero's first impression of the Count Valentin, moreover, had been agreeable. His mistrust expired, and he said he would be very glad to see the house. The young man gave a frank laugh and laid his hand on one of the candlesticks. "Good, good!" he exclaimed. "Come, then." But Madame de Cintré rose quickly and grasped his arm. "Ah, Valentin," she said, "what do you mean to do?" "To show Mr. Newman the house. It will be very amusing." She kept her hand on his arm and turned to Newman with a smile. "Don't let him take you," she said. "You will not find it amusing. It is a musty old house, like any other." "It is full of curious things," said the count, resisting. "Besides, I want to do it. It is a rare chance." "You are very wicked, brother," Madame de Cintré answered. "Nothing venture, nothing have," cried the young man. "Will you come?" Madame de Cintré stepped toward Newman, gently clasping her hands and smiling softly. "Would you not prefer my society, here by the fire, to stumble about dark passages after my brother?" "100 times," said Newman. "We will see the house some other day." The young man put down his candlestick with a mock solemnity, and shaking his head. "Ah, you have defeated a great scheme, sir," he said. "A scheme? I don't understand," said Newman. "You would have played your part in it all the better. Perhaps some day I shall have a chance to explain it." "Be quiet and ring for the tea," said Madame de Cintré. The young man obeyed, and presently a servant brought in the tea, placed the tray on a small table, and departed. Madame de Cintré, from her place, busied herself with making it. She had but just begun when the door was thrown open and a lady rushed in, making a loud rustling sound. She stared at Newman, gave a little nod and a "Monsieur," and then quickly approached Madame de Cintré and presented her forehead to be kissed. Madame de Cintré saluted her and continued to make tea. The newcomer was young and pretty, it seemed to Newman. She wore her bonnet and cloak in a train of royal proportions. She began to talk rapidly in French. "Oh, give me some tea, my beautiful one, for the love of God! I'm exhausted, mangled, massacred." Newman found himself quite unable to follow her. She spoke much less distinctly than M. Nioche. "That is my sister-in-law," said the Count Valentin, leaning towards him. "She is very pretty," said Newman. "Exquisite," answered the young man, and this time again Newman suspected him of irony. His sister-in-law came round to the other side of the fire with her cup of tea in her hand, holding it out at arm's length so that she might not spill it on her dress, and uttering little cries of alarm. She placed the cup on the mantel-shelf and began to unpin her veil and pull off her gloves, looking meanwhile at Newman. "Is there anything I can do for you, my dear lady?" the Count Valentin asked, in a sort of mock caressing tone. "Present monsieur," said his sister-in-law. The young man answered, "Mr. Newman." "I can't curtsy to you, monsieur, or I shall spill my tea," said the lady. "So Claire receives strangers like that?" she added in a low voice in French to her brother-in-law. "Apparently," he answered with a smile. Newman stood a moment, and then he approached Madame de Cintré. She looked up at him as if she were thinking of something to say, but she seemed to think of nothing, so she simply smiled. He sat down near her and she handed him a cup of tea. For a few moments they talked about that, and meanwhile he looked at her. He remembered what Mrs. Tristram had told him of her perfection, and of her having, in combination, all the brilliant things that he dreamed of finding. This made him observe her not only without mistrust, but without uneasy conjectures. The presumption, from the first moment he looked at her, had been in her favor. And yet, if she was beautiful, it was not a dazzling beauty. She was tall and molded in long lines. She had thick fair hair, a wide forehead, and features with a sort of harmonious irregularity. Her clear gray eyes were strikingly expressive. They were both gentle and intelligent, and Newman liked them immensely, but they had not those depths of splendor, those many-colored rays, which illumine the brows of famous beauties. Madame de Cintré was rather thin, and she looked younger than probably she was. In her whole person there was something both youthful and subdued, slender and yet ample, tranquil and yet shy, a mixture of immaturity and repose, of innocence and dignity. What had Tristram meant, Newman wondered, by calling her proud? She was certainly not proud now to him, or if she was, it was of no use, it was lost upon him. She must pile it up higher if she expected him to mind it. She was a beautiful woman, and it was very easy to get on with her. Was she a countess, a marquise, a kind of historical formation? Newman, who had rarely heard these words used, had never been at pains to attach any particular image to them, but they occurred to him now and seemed charged with a sort of melodious meaning. They signified something fair and softly bright, that had easy motions and spoke very agreeably. "Have you many friends in Paris? Do you go out?" asked Madame de Cintré, who had at last thought of something to say. "Do you mean, do I dance and all that? Do you go dans le monde, as we say?" "I have seen a good many people. Mrs. Tristram has taken me about. I do whatever she tells me." "By yourself you are not fond of amusements?" "Oh yes, of some sorts. I am not fond of dancing and that sort of thing. I am too old and sober. But I want to be amused. I came to Europe for that." "But you can be amused in America, too." "I couldn't. I was always at work. But after all, that was my amusement." At this moment Madame de Bellegarde came back for another cup of tea, accompanied by the Count Valentin. Madame de Cintré, when she had served her, began to talk again with Newman, and recalling what he had last said, "In your own country you were very much occupied?" she asked. "I was in business. I have been in business since I was 15 years old." "And what was your business?" asked Madame de Bellegarde, who was decidedly not so pretty as Madame de Cintré. "I have been in everything," said Newman. "At one time I sold leather. At one time I manufactured wash tubs." Madame de Bellegarde made a little grimace. "Leather? I don't like that. Wash tubs are better. I prefer the smell of soap. I hope at least they made your fortune." She rattled this off with the air of a woman who had the reputation of saying everything that came into her head, and with a strong French accent. Newman had spoken with cheerful seriousness, but Madame de Bellegarde's tone made him go on, after a meditative pause, with a certain light grimness of jocularity. "No, I lost money on wash tubs, but I came out pretty square on leather." "I have made up my mind, after all," said Madame de Bellegarde, "that the great point is, how do you call it, to come out square. I am on my knees to money, I don't deny it. If you have it, I ask no questions. For that I am a real democrat, like you, monsieur. Madame de Cintré is very proud, but I find that one gets much more pleasure in this sad life if one doesn't look too close." "Just heaven, dear madam, how you go at it!" said the Count Valentin, lowering his voice. "He's a man one can speak to, I suppose, since my sister receives him," the lady answered. "Besides, it's very true. Those are my ideas." "Ah, you call them ideas," murmured the young man. "But Mrs. Tristram told me that you had been in the army, in your war," said Madame de Cintré. "Yes, but that is not business," said Newman. "Very true," said M. de Bellegarde. "Otherwise, perhaps, I should not be penniless." "Is it true," asked Newman in a moment, "that you are so proud? I had already heard it." Madame de Cintré smiled. "Do you find me so?" "Oh," said Newman, "I am no judge. If you are proud with me, you will have to tell me; otherwise I shall not know it." Madame de Cintré began to laugh. "That would be pride in a sad position," she said. "It would be partly," Newman went on, "because I shouldn't want to know it. I want you to treat me well." Madame de Cintré, whose laugh had ceased, looked at him with her head half averted, as if she feared what he was going to say. "Mrs. Tristram told you the literal truth," he went on. "I want very much to know you. I didn't come here simply to call today. I came in the hope that you might ask me to come again." "Oh, pray come often," said Madame de Cintré. "But will you be at home?" Newman insisted. Even to himself he seemed a trifle pushing, but he was in truth a trifle excited. "I hope so," said Madame de Cintré. Newman got up. "Well, we shall see," he said, smoothing his hat with his coat cuff. "Brother," said Madame de Cintré, "invite Mr. Newman to come again." The Count Valentin looked at our hero from head to foot with his peculiar smile, in which impudence and urbanity seemed perplexingly commingled. "Are you a brave man?" he asked, eyeing him askance. "Well, I hope so," said Newman. "I rather suspect so. In that case, come again." "Ah, what an invitation!" murmured Madame de Cintré, with something painful in her smile. "Oh, I want Mr. Newman to come, particularly," said the young man. "It will give me great pleasure. I shall be desolate if I miss one of his visits. But I maintain he must be brave. A stout heart, sir!" And he offered Newman his hand. "I shall not come to see you. I shall come to see Madame de Cintré," said Newman. "You will need all the more courage." "Ah, Valentin!" said Madame de Cintré appealingly. "Decidedly!" cried Madame de Bellegarde. "I am the only person here capable of saying something polite. Come to see me; you will need no courage," she said. Newman gave a laugh which was not altogether an assent, and took his leave. Madame de Cintré did not take up her sister's challenge to be gracious, but she looked with a certain troubled air at the retreating guest. Chapter 7